The 2025 offseason is almost here, so in this video, let's go ahead and do my updated NFL mock draft. But if you guys do go on to enjoy the video, hit the like and subscribe button. We are on the road to 10K, so subscribe if you're not subscribed. Let's hop into it. All right, and we are going to begin with the Tennessee Titans, who have locked up the #1 overall pick. There is a very solid chance they do end up taking a quarterback, but based off everything that I have been hearing regarding this Titans team, they're going to take the best player on the board. And well, I don't think the best player on the board this year is going to be a quarterback. Now, I would not be shocked one bit if they were to decide to take a quarterback, but in this situation, I do think this team would be smart to just go with best player available. They need help both in the cornerback room, wide receiver room, edge rushing room, so the top two guys on the board are Travis Hunter and Abdul Carter for this Titans team. I could see a hypothetical scenario where they actually trade down with the New York Giants, but we'll have to wait to see if that ends up happening or not. In this situation, though, I think I'm just going to take Travis Hunter because I think he kind of hits two of their issues with one. He can play both wide receiver, also playing some corner. I think a hypothetical duo of Calvin Ridley and Travis Hunter would be a really solid, formidable duo at wide receiver. Not to mention, you brought in L'Jarius Sneed last offseason, so having Travis Hunter pair alongside him and whoever else they got, I think would make that secondary a whole lot better. He's a great playmaker. The only thing I do worry about with him is, can he stay healthy if he does decide to do both positions to some degree? He is a little bit wiry and did go through a couple injuries with Colorado, so that is concerning, but as long as we're not that worried about that, I think he's going to be a great player. Then there's the Cleveland Browns. Now, I really did consider taking Abdul Carter here, but ultimately speaking, I had to go ahead and just take the quarterback. This is a team that hasn't had their quarterback situation figured out for years at this point. And I just don't see a world where Kevin Stefanski goes into the 2025 season with either Deshaun Watson, DTR, Jameis Winston, or I don't know, some B-level quarterback like Mac Jones on the roster. So I think this team has to figure out their quarterback position, and I do think Cam Ward could be the guy. While I personally do think Shedeur might be a better fit in their system, I think Cam Ward might have a higher ceiling. And if you are Kevin Stefanski and you want to buy yourself some time to be the head coach for this team moving forward, I do think Cam Ward would be the guy that would give you a couple years to kind of figure things out. Then there is the New York Giants, and a lot of the same principles that I said about the Cleveland Browns and Kevin Stefanski also kind of does follow suit with the New York Giants and Brian Daboll. This is a team that simply has not had the quarterback position figured out for years and years and years at this point, so they kind of have to figure out the quarterback position, and I do think Shedeur Sanders would be a really solid fit in their system. Now, I actually think Cam Ward might be a better fit, but with Shedeur Sanders, I do think you're getting somebody who is extremely accurate, has dealt with poor offensive line play in Colorado, and I think does have a really solid arm. His playmaking does leave a little bit to be desired, but I do think that he can improve on that, and if he can improve on that, then I do think we're talking about a quarterback that can be a really solid quarterback. This Giants team, in my opinion, has a lot of talent. It's just kind of missing a couple pieces here and there, and I think the beginning of those pieces is, of course, a quarterback. Having Shedeur Sanders play alongside guys like Malik Neighbors, to me, would be really enticing, not to mention Tyrone Tracy looked pretty good, so I think you have to go with the quarterback, and I think it's Shedeur Sanders. Then there's the New England Patriots. Now, I think a lot of the players that are on the board make a lot of sense for the Patriots. You can go Abdul Carter to get yourself a certified edge rusher 1, or you can go Ted McMillan to give your quarterback a wide receiver prospect who I think is a really fantastic prospect. You can even go Mason Graham, Will Johnson, Malachi Starks, hell, even Ashton Genty makes some sense. But in this situation, I'm going to go with the best prospect on the board, and that is Abdul Carter. This dude is a freak athlete, kind of reminds me a little bit of Micah. I know there's some obvious comparisons in terms of Penn State, where's number 11, converted linebacker to edge rusher, but in a lot of ways, they are very similar players. The good news for the Patriots is that Abdul Carter is still developing and still growing, and I think there's already a really good foundation to build upon. We're talking about a guy who was dominant at Penn State, dominated some of the top schools in the country, and I still think there's a lot of room to grow. So this is a guy who I really do believe could come into this league and probably drop 8 sacks his rookie year, and then as time goes on, could develop into becoming a 10 to 15 sack per season type of guy. I think Abdul Carter is the type of guy that can completely change games just overall with his performance, with the way that he does things and just dominates this position. He's a complete game changer. He's a game wrecker. He could be a really good player for that Patriots team that has needed some juice on the defensive line for honestly a couple years now. Then there's the Jacksonville Jaguars. Now, I think the two top prospects for them is Will Johnson and Mason Graham. I can honestly go 50-50 on either one of these players. I think they're both really good players. I would say that Mason Graham is a bit more of a sure prospect who I think would be a fantastic fit on that defensive line. The only reason why I would consider going with Will Johnson is because I think the secondary is worse than the defensive line. However, if you want to build a strength on this team, I think adding Mason Graham makes a bunch of sense. And I will say, I think there's a couple corners you can take in the second or third round that could be guys who can get playing time on this team. So I am going to go with Mason Graham in this situation. He's somebody who I know what I'm going to be getting as a prospect. He's going to be a dominant run stuffer with a player who I think has a decent ability to be a good pass rusher in this league. You pair him alongside what you already have on that defensive line, and I think you're looking at one of the better defensive lines in the entire league. And if you can build that strength in Jacksonville, you can begin the process of really figuring things out in other position groups. Build a strength on the defensive line, fix your secondary through free agency and through the drafts, and I think this team defensively could be a lot better next year. Then there's the Raiders. Now, in this situation, I think you have to add to the offensive side of the football. I know their defense was a little bit lackluster, and a guy like Will Johnson would make a bunch of sense for this team, but I think I'm leaning towards taking a guy like Ashton Jeanty or Tetairoa McMillan. The reason why I say that is because the offense for the Raiders has just been so lackluster and just so undynamic for years at this point. And yeah, Davante Adams brought them a little bit of juice, but there was really nothing outside of him. Josh Jacobs had a couple good years with the Raiders, and then it kind of just fizzled out towards the end, which was a bit of a bummer. Then last year you were relying on guys like Amir Abdullah and Alexander Madison, and that was a complete disaster. I think there is some potential guys you can get in free agency to add to your receiving core. Not to mention, I do think there's a couple underrated receivers in the second or third round that this Raiders team could potentially look at to add to their team. So because of that, I know the running back class is pretty deep, but Ashton Jeanty to me is the best prospect on the board. So I'm going to go ahead and take Ashton Jeanty to just give this offense some actual juice. And I think because we've seen guys like Saquon and Derrick Henry kind of carry their teams, I think somebody like Ashton Jeanty could be similar for this Raiders roster. Next is the New York Jets, and Will Johnson, I think, is going to come off the board here. I have seen some people talk about Will Johnson potentially dropping out of the top 10, and I can kind of understand why. He doesn't have the greatest speed in the world. He's also a little bit lackluster in coverage sometimes, but I think he is an elite playmaker with good size, good frame, and I think his speed is definitely fine enough. Again, I know there's question marks with some tackling issues as well and just the overall deep speed, but again, I'm not too worried about that, especially when you have somebody like Sauce Gardner on the other side. I think having two guys with a very good frame, very good size, very good instincts and ability, and a lot of good playmaking skills too, I think that would make for a secondary that would be really, really nasty. This Carolina, unfortunately, a lot of the top prospects are on the board, and truth be told, Carolina falling to 8 is actually really bad for this team because a lot of these players that will be taken in the top 7 are the elite blue chip prospects, but after that, you start to kind of fall for guys who I don't think are necessarily blue chip guys. But of the guys on the board, I do think the defensive line has to be a priority for this team. I know it's a pretty deep edge class, but I think you have to get that certified top tier edge rusher. And again, no Abdul Carter, so you're probably just looking at the second best available guy. And for me, I think I lean towards James Pierce Jr. His draft stock has fallen a tad bit. Some people have him going late in the first round. Some people have him going a little bit earlier. At one point, way time ago, he was the first overall pick projection. I think James Pierce Jr. does have the upside to be a very good pass rusher in the league. Yes, there are some concerns with, his run defense, his size, inconsistency at times, but I do think for the Carolina Panthers, they could be a team that might be willing to take a risk on a guy who does have the upside to be a very dominant pass rusher. I like Mike Green, but taking him top 10 is just a little bit too rich for my liking. Maybe like after top 10, I can understand it. He's just a little bit raw as a prospect and is extremely light, only about 240 pounds, whereas James Pierce Jr. is also light, but has a frame that I think could really add size to it. I could go Will Campbell, or I even could go Malachi Starks to add to their offensive line or safety room, but I think the edge rushing room has got to get some juice, so I'm going to go ahead and go with James Pierce Jr. here. Then there is the New Orleans Saints, and kind of similar to the Panthers, they're kind of in a situation where they can't go with the top prospect on the board anymore. They're going to have to kind of reach on a certain prospect. Maybe they could reach on a Mike Green or a Nick Scourton or Michael Williams. Those are all possibilities, but I look at somebody like Malachi Starks. I think that he could really add something to this secondary. Yes, you have Tyrann Mathieu, who's a bit more of your free roaming safety, but I think Malachi Starks can do a little bit more in terms of being a free safety, a strong safety, maybe even play in the nickel if need be. This dude is aggressive as hell. He can tackle like a madman. He's really solid in coverage, and I think he has pretty good tracking ability too. His 2024 was a little bit disappointing compared to 2023, but I don't really know if I should be blaming him or the overall talent level of the defensive, especially the secondary around him. So because that, I think Malachi Starks would give this Saints team something that they just don't have right now. Not to mention Tyrann Mathieu getting older and is coming off probably one of his worst years in the NFL. So we'll take Malachi Starks to kind of work alongside what you have there. And I think a duo of Kool-Aid McKinstry and Malachi Starks moving forward could make this secondary pretty darn good. Then there is the Chicago Bears. I feel like I don't have to go through this one that much because it feels like every single mock draft is pushing Will Campbell to the Chicago Bears. So I'm not going to change the formula up here. I think Will Campbell has the highest upside of any offensive lineman in this year's draft. You can play him out as tackle. You could play him inside as a guard. There is concerns with his overall frame and arm length, which is understandable, especially if you're talking about a tackle. One concern I do have with him is when you have a guy who can really have long arms and can push his body backwards, it's going to be really difficult for Will Campbell to get a hold of them and, control the block. It was an issue we saw quite often at LSU and is probably the most dominant reason why he gave up a couple sacks last year. But if you move him inside as a guard, I think he has the frame, the stature, the lower half to really squat down and get his hands on those big defensive tackles. Not to mention in that position, you're talking about somebody who needs to be smart, needs to be extremely aware of what's going on. And I do think Will Campbell has the intelligence and overall ideas of how to play offensive line at a high level. So I'm going to go ahead and take Will Campbell here. Then there is the San Francisco 49ers. Now, in a lot of my past mock drafts, I've given them Josh Simmons or Kelvin Banks. And in a typical mock draft, I probably would end up doing the same. But I want to kind of mix it up a little bit here. I think they might want to look on the edge rushing room or even in the secondary to add a prospect there. When it comes to the secondary, there are a couple names I really do like. Jahdae Barron, I think, is a fantastic player, but taking him in the 11th pick might be a little bit rich for me. Same thing with Benjamin Morrison. I really think he is a high-level prospect, but the injury concerns are really legit. He's coming off a massive injury at Notre Dame that I think could potentially push him out of like a top 15 pick. So in that situation, I think I'm looking for the most juiced up edge rusher on the board. And there are a couple names that I am a pretty decent big fan of. Talking about guys like Micah Williams, Mike Green, Shamar Stewart, Jack Sawyer, Nick Scowerton, who I think is a little bit underranked here. These are all names that I think could be fantastic picks alongside what you already have in Nick Bosa. And I think what you're looking for alongside Nick Bosa is somebody who has traits, who can be good in run stuffing while also being good enough to get you close to like 8 to 10 sacks a year. And what I feel like Mike Green might fall a little bit short for this pick here is he is a lighter frame guy. And I just don't know if they would want a lighter frame guy around Nick Bosa. You really want somebody around Nick Bosa who has the size and length and also the capability of being a little bit bigger. And that brings me to Micah Williams and Nick Scowerton. Now, Nick Scowerton's like 280 pounds, but Micah Williams is a little bit lighter, around 265. Micah Williams, to me, has those rare traits, extremely long arms, very versatile guy. The questions for him is he had a bit of a down year for Georgia because of some injuries. So can he recover from that? And can he kind of get back to form a tad bit? When he showed flashes, they were ridiculous flashes. We're talking about a guy who could be a very good pass rusher and I think can be a really good run stuffer as well. So I think you pair him alongside what you already have in Nick Bosa and you can make for a really good defensive line that has been trying to figure things out but hasn't really ever been as good as what maybe was thought to be on paper. So I think by adding Micah Williams, you're adding a dominant pass rusher alongside Nick Bosa. Again, in past mocks, I've done Josh Simmons, I've done Kelvin Banks, so that would probably be my pick if I was in that room, but Micah Williams you cannot go wrong with. Then there's the Dallas Cowboys, and there are a lot of different options for the Cowboys here. This actually might be best case scenario for the Cowboys if the draft actually does fall this way. Because on the board, you have your top two tackle prospects who are Josh Simmons and Kelvin Banks. Not to mention you have other guys too like Armand Membu and then later down the board, Josh Connerly. You also have top tier wide receiver prospects like Ted McMillan, who I think would be fantastic next to CeeDee Lamb. Luther Burden, who also has versatility, who I think could be a good fit next to CeeDee Lamb as well. Emeka Egbuka is also great. You also have some really good pass rushers if you want to replace DeMarcus Lawrence and pair Micah Parsons with a bit more of a pass rushing type of guy. Mike Green could be an excellent fit here. But to me, I think the Dallas Cowboys should really focus their 2025 NFL draft on taking best player available in positions of need to just give as much star power as you can for this offense, which has been kind of lackluster lately. You have Dak Prescott, who I think is a good quarterback. You don't really have a running back, but with Ashton Genty off the board, you could probably wait to the second round. And outside of CeeDee Lamb, their second best receiver right now is Jalen Tolbert, who on most teams is a 3 or a 4. So we're going to go ahead and take Ted McMillan because I think his play style next to CeeDee Lamb's would be fantastic. He's long, he's rangy, he's wiry. For his size, he's actually a really solid athlete. The route running leaves a little bit to be desired, but ultimately I'm not too worried about that. I also do think on press man coverage, he can be a little bit inconsistent at times, but in this league, you're not really going to see too many corners do that because of just how big and long and rangy Ted McMillan is. He's got very good hands. What I like about Ted McMillan, and it's something that a lot of people talk about with his game, when he goes for the football, it isn't like he's going with his body. Like you see a lot of body catchers in the NFL. That's not Ted McMillan. This dude wants to catch everything with his hands, and he's got massive freaking baseball mitts on his hands, so he can catch everything. You paired that with CeeDee Lamb, and I think you're giving Dak Prescott a legitimate weapon who I think could be an excellent player in this league. Then there is the Miami Dolphins. Now, typically I've gone Malachi Starks, but he's no longer on the board. He was taken by the Saints, and I think with the offensive lineman kind of dropping here, it makes a lot of sense to just go with the best offensive lineman available. For me, I'm a big fan of Kelvin Banks because I think between him and Josh Simmons, I think he might have a bit more versatility to play guard if need be. Though I do think that he'll likely stick as a tackle, you can definitely move him inside to guard if you want to. Probably the best pass protector in this year's draft, but there are some question marks with his run blocking. He could be a little bit erratic with his technique and certain things like that. He just can kind of be all over the place. But when it comes to his pass protection, I mean, this dude is as solid as a rock. You're not going to give up too many sacks with Kelvin Banks. He's going to be a great tackle in this league. But if you want to move him inside to guard, I do think it could definitely help him out in that run blocking department because when he's out in space, it can be a little bit erratic. But again, I think as a pass protector, he would have to his back the entire time. Then there's the Indianapolis Colts. I have done this pick a lot of my mock drafts lately, and I think it's going to consistently be my pick. I'm going to go with Tyler Warren. This pick just makes so much sense. The Colts have been desperately trying to figure out their tight end room for so long now, and by adding a guy like Tyler Warren, who I think can be an excellent run blocker while also being a good chip blocker, and also just being a dynamic weapon that can do so much for your offense, I think he'd be fantastic for this team. This is a Colts offense that is a little bit unorthodox because they kind of have to with Anthony Richardson, and by getting somebody who is as unorthodox as they come in Tyler Warren, it would make this offense that much better. I think Tyler Warren is my tight end #1 prospect. I definitely prefer him over Colston Loveland. He may not have the receiving upside of Colston Loveland, but I think as a pure dynamic playmaker weapon, Tyler Warren is, in my opinion, a much better prospect. So because I think the Colts would be a little bit stupid to not take him there. Sure, you could add a corner, you could add a edge rusher, so on and so forth, but it just makes so much more sense for Tyler Warren to go to the Colts as their best tight end player on the team. Then there is the Atlanta Falcons. Edge rusher has got to be the pick here, and there are a couple names I really do like. Mike Reed might be the most high upside pass rusher. Jack Sawyer has kind of increased his draft stock tremendously. Shamar Stewart, I don't know if he gives you the edge rusher that this team really could use. Nick Scourton is also on the board, but I think I'm going to go ahead and just take Mike Green. Again, he is a little bit undersized, only about 200, I think, 249, 248, but is 6'4", redshirt sophomore, so still has a lot of room to grow. Played at Marshall, so never went up against the greatest competition, so it will be interesting to see how his game can translate to the NFL level. But what I will say is I do think that he has the technique, the ability, the ranginess, the good arms length. I think his pass rushing tool set is still developing, but is definitely there. So I think Mike Green is probably the most juiced up defensive edge rusher that could really give this team a pass rushing element that they just don't have right now. So we're going to go with Mike Green. Then that takes me to the Cardinals, and the fall for Nick Scourton isn't going to go too much further because I think Nick Scourton makes just too much sense for this Cardinals team. Nick Scourton has versatility to play both edge as well as if you need him to in a pinch, you could play him inside as an interior guy. Again, he's around 280 pounds. He is a massive guy. But what I will say is for 280 pounds, he definitely carries it very well. This is a guy who is extremely athletic for his size. He can move people around while also being a little bit juicy as a pass rusher. Overall, there's a Cardinals defensive line that just hasn't had a whole lot of juice as of late. So by adding a guy like Nick Scourton, I think you're getting somebody who can provide that juice as a pass rusher. Probably will never be a 15 sack a season type of guy, but if he can get his technique down and sound, I think he could be. Then there's the Bengals. I don't know if T. Higgins is going to be back, so I'm going to work under the assumption that Higgins isn't back. And I think by adding a guy like Luther Burden to this team would make this offense just extremely versatile while also extremely dynamic like they have been. Now, Luther Burden isn't a T. Higgins clone. If you're looking for a more T. Higgins guy, you're looking at like a Ted McMillan type of guy. But what I will say is Luther Burden is a bit more like a Jamar Chase or CeeDee Lamb more than anything else. You're probably line him up a lot in the slot, but he can play on the outside if you need him to. The dude has speed, he's got range, he's got size. I think his hands are pretty good. You give him the ball in space, the dude can take it 50 yards. Like, that's just the level of athlete that this guy is. Had a bit of a down year for Missouri because quarterback play was just god-awful this year for that team, but I still think Luther Burden is a totally fine prospect that I feel totally fine taking in the first round. There's been a lot of buzz lately about Matthew Golden, which I'm happy for because he's an excellent player, but I don't know if I would take him over Luther Burden. Same thing with Emeka Egbuka. Emeka's a good player too. You can honestly take him here as well. I have no issue with it, but I'm going to take Luther Burden here to be my T. Higgins replacement. You could go edge rusher, but again, a lot of the edges are off the board now, so you're probably reaching on Jack Sawyer if you want to, but I think Luther Burden makes a lot of sense. Then there's the Seahawks, one of the worst offensive lines in the NFL, and maybe not the worst, but inconsistent offensive lines for sure. Josh Simmons comes in there, takes over the tackle position that has been a bit of a revolving door for that team just because of injuries. So Josh Simmons comes in there, gives them a foundation guy they can build with. He is coming off an injury, which is concerning, especially with Seattle's history of injuries in the offensive line. But if he can stay healthy, I think he's a fantastic a fantastic tackle, and arguably could be a top 10 pick if he wasn't injured. Then there's the Buccaneers at pick 19. I think this team needs to look for either an edge rusher 1 or a cornerback 1, and unfortunately, because the edge rushers are no longer on the board, I'm going to go ahead and take the top corner on the board. Me personally, I prefer Jahdae Barron, but what I will say is he doesn't have the size or the frame of like a true cornerback 1, whereas Benjamin Morrison does have that size and frame. Jahdae Barron gives you more flexibility and a bit more of a sure prospect, but Benjamin Morrison is a bit more of a higher ceiling level player. Like, I think Jahdae Barron can be a really excellent corner in this league. He can be a cornerback 1 for a lot of teams, but I don't know if his ceiling is as high as somebody like Benjamin Morrison's, because if Benjamin Morrison comes back from this injury 100%, we're talking about a guy that could have been a top 10 pick, whereas for Jahdae Barron, he was last year probably considered like a 5th round pick, a 4th round pick at best, but because of how dominant he was in 2024, he's moved up to becoming a 1st round pick. Benjamin Morrison has been that guy for a lot longer, and I just think that he is a bit more of a higher ceiling level guy. Very good size, very good range, very good technique. He's sound. He's just a really good player. The concerns just kind of come back to, is he going to be able to return from injury? Then there's the Broncos, and I think Emeka Egbuka is completely their style of wide receiver. You're talking about somebody who is just smart, crafty, solid at everything. I don't necessarily know if he will be this team's wide receiver 1, but you have Courtland Sutton who can kind of be that guy who's maybe a bit more of your deep threat, whereas Emeka can stick in your slot and just be a consistent weapon for Bo Nix to throw the ball to. You already have some other guys out there who provide a bit more of the speed element, or obviously Courtland Sutton's a bit more of your deep ball guy. Emeka Egbuka to me is almost a perfect fit for this system of the Denver Broncos. Now, if Tyler Warren was here, I would take Tyler Warren, but he's not. Emeka Egbuka to me is just a perfect fit for this offense and would give Bo Nix a second weapon that this team has kind of been needing lately. Then there is the Pittsburgh Steelers. I think you have to add some weapons to this offense. Outside of George Pickens, you're really just running with nobody out there. I mean, you got a couple guys. Roman Wilson, we'll see if he can play next year, but he was a complete no-show this year. Matthew Golden is somebody who, as I mentioned earlier, has completely flown up draft boards. I've seen some people like, I believe Daniel Jeremiah said he was his wide receiver 1, which is a little bit crazy for me, but I could definitely see why. We're talking about somebody who has elite speed, very good route running ability. I think his route running arguably is the best in this year's draft class, maybe outside of Emeka Egbuka, but I think there's an argument for Matthew Golden. He is as sure-handed as they come in this year's draft. I mean, he can win those 50-50 balls if you need him to, and I just think he's a good player. The question for him is the size is a little bit concerning. He's not massive, and he's only 6 foot 195, but he feels like a little bit smaller than like a typical 6 foot guy. So that is a bit of a concern, but when you already have the size with George Pickens, who can be a bit more of your deep threat, you can really work Matthew Golden as your number 2 guy who could play a similar role to like a Jackson Smith and Jigba, whereas George Pickens could be a bit more of like your DK Metcalf type of guy. So I think Matthew Golden makes a lot of sense for the Steelers team, and I just think he's an excellent player. Then there's the Chargers. In past mocks, I've done wide receivers, but a lot of the receivers are off the board, so we'll take the top tight end on the board, and well, he's a Michigan guy, so it makes a lot of sense. Colston Loveland, I believe, had some injuries this year, or just missed a couple games because of whatever reason. I'm not too familiar with that, but what I will say about Colston Loveland is he's a bit of a project tight end when it comes to run blocking and things like that, but he is by far the best, maybe pure receiving option in this tight end class. I like Tyler Warren a lot, but Colston Loveland has the size, the frame, the speed, the athleticism to give an offense a lot of juice in that tight end room. And for a team like the Chargers that already feel like they have a bit of a core of wide receivers brewing over there with Ladd McConkey and maybe Quentin Johnston, we'll we'll see. Adding a tight end like Colston Loveland would just give this offense a lot more weapons to work with. I think that's got to be the #1 goal for this Chargers team, getting weapons for Justin Herbert to work with, and I think Colston Loveland could be a guy for them. Then there's the Packers, and I'm looking really at edge rusher, and I think of Shamar Stewart and Jack Sawyer, I'm a little bit more tempted to go with Jack Sawyer. Lucas Van Ness has just not really worked out for them, and Rashawn Gary has been a little bit disappointing in terms of how much they paid him and how little production they've got from him. Jack Sawyer to me is a very safe prospect who I know what I'm getting with him. The dude is strong, lengthy, rangy, maybe doesn't have the greatest like athleticism for this position. Like he's not a Jalen Walker or a Mike Green per se, but the dude is strong as hell. When he puts his hands on you and gets his pads underneath you, he's going to push you into the quarterback. Kind of reminds me of Jared Verse in some ways, but I don't think is as high level of a player as Jared Verse, but in terms of their play style, it's kind of similar to one another. Again, the dude is long, rangy, has been productive for Ohio State for many years, and his draft stock has completely changed over the course of the past few weeks because of how dominant he was against teams like Texas. I mean, he just destroyed Cameron Williams on that strip sack that led to his touchdown. I mean, watch that play. He obliterated Cameron Williams, who, by the way, at one point was a first-round pick, probably now more like a second-round pick. Then there is the Minnesota Vikings. Their biggest need is interior offensive linemen, but unfortunately for them, a lot of the interior offensive linemen that are in this year's draft I don't know are worthy of the pick 24. You could go Booker, who I think is of the guys available, probably by far the best interior offensive lineman. You could even look at potentially going for an offensive tackle like Wyatt Milam or Armon Menbu and move them into the interior offensive line. Of the guys there, I think Wyatt Milam might be the guy who I might end up taking here because I think he's a bit more of a sure prospect as an interior guy, but I do like Armon Menbu too, who can play tackle or play guard as well. I think I'm going to go ahead and take Armon Menbu. I really am a big fan of Armon Menbu. He is also, his stock has driven up a ton more too. 0 sacks given up this year, 0 hits, only 9 hurries on over 827 snaps, 6'3", 314. I think he has the size, the frame, and speed. The question would be, are they going to keep him out as a tackle or are they going to move him inside to guard? That would be the question for them. In this position, I think I'm going to go ahead and take Armon Menbu to be the pick here. Then there's the Houston Texans, and I think this kind of is the same philosophy with this Vikings team. Interior offensive line is a big need for this team. Yes, wide receiver is a need, but I think in this situation, there isn't a wide receiver worth taking. Maybe Alec Ayamanor, but he is kind of similar to Nico Collins with, being good size, good frame, jump ball 50-50 type of guy, but I don't think you need him, to be honest with you. If you bring back Stephon Diggs and if Tank Dell comes back fine, then I think the receiving core is generally okay. Interior offensive line was just really inconsistent for this team this year, and by adding a guy like Wyatt Milam, I think he makes a ton of sense. Truth be told, you could flip these picks. If Minnesota wants to take Wyatt Milam and Houston wants to take Armon Menbu, makes a bunch of sense to me. Then there is the LA Rams. I think this team just needs to add to their secondary. It's been okay these past few years, but I think it's been missing that top tier, top level talent. And while I do like guys like Trey Amos, Siobhan Rebel, Darian Porter's an interesting prospect. Same with Zay Alexander and Maxwell Hairston, who Maxwell Hairston is probably a late first, early second round pick. I think Jahdae Barron is by far the best player. Not to mention, there is some weird connection between Texas and the LA Rams. Not necessarily like a personnel wise, but if you go on Instagram, these dudes are like always tagging each other in some ways. So there is some connection with Steve Sarkisian and Sean McVay to some extent. So I think Jahdae Barron make a bunch of sense. Again, as I said earlier, Jahdae Barron gives you versatility to play him in the nickel, play him on the outside, play him in safety. Doesn't necessarily have the greatest deep field speed. I think if you were to put him up against Tyreek Hill, he could potentially get burnt, but that's why you put a safety over the top Tyreek Hill, because basically every corner gets burnt. But I think his corner speed is totally fine. You're talking about somebody who could run like a 4.50, 4.49, something along those lines, which is totally fine for the position. His technique is incredible, and I think of the corners here, maybe outside of Will Johnson and Travis Hunter, if you consider him a corner, Jahdae Barron has arguably the best playmaking skill of this class. The Thorpe Award winner was worthy of the award, won it over the likes of some really good players like Caleb Downs. So I'm going to give this one to Jahdae Barron. I think he'd be a fantastic fit for this Rams team. Then there is the Ravens, and I kind of went back and forth on what I was going to take here. I could have went with like a Josh Connerly or even potentially a Tyler Booker because there is some question marks with the offensive line. But ultimately speaking, I decided to just kind of stick with the defensive line here, and I think Shamar Stewart would be a perfect fit for this team. This team, pass rushing wise, just kind of felt like it was missing something throughout the year. Like Matabike had a good year, and Odafe Owe was also great this year, but adding a Shamar Stewart who gives them versatility to play on the interior or play on the edge rushing room. I mean, the dude is massive. The dude is 6'6", 290, but kind of like Nick Scarrington, he's massive, but he carries his weight very well. He's extremely athletic. I think maybe not twitchy would be the right word for him, but a fantastic athlete for his size. And again, I think he gives that defensive line a lot of versatility, and putting out a pass rushing unit of Odafe Owe, Matabike, and Shamar Stewart, and then of course somebody else like a Travis Jones would make that defensive line just extremely nasty. Then there is the Detroit Lions. Lots of question marks with their interior offensive line because of just age, free agency, and so on and so forth. So by adding a guy like Tyler Booker to replace probably Kevin Zeitler more than likely, it would just make a bunch of sense. Tyler Booker is the type of dude, if he puts his hands on you, it's game over. Like if he puts his hands on you, you are not simply moving. You are going to get stuck there. And that's what you want in a guard. He isn't necessarily the freakiest athlete in the world. So if you ask him to do like some pulls or get out on a screen and help Jahmyr Gibbs down the field, I don't really know if he gives you too much of that, but I think he's capable of it. And I think given some time and some years to develop, he can definitely be that guy for this team. Tyler Booker to me represents what the Detroit Lions are as a unit. Of being just nasty, physical, push you into the ground and bite your kneecap off. That's what Tyler Booker would be. Then there's Washington. As much as I would love to go wide receiver on the board here, there isn't anybody who I'm like extremely loving. Although I will say Alec Ayamanor could be a fun fit next to Terry McLaurin. You could also go with Josh Connerly because there is some question marks with the offensive line, but I actually think I'm going to go with the wide receiver here, Alec Ayamanor. I mean, this is a Washington team that just didn't have anything in the receiving core outside of Zach Ertz, who's like 50, and Terry McLaurin, who's incredible. So adding a guy like Alec Ayamanor would give them somebody who I think would give a little bit of help in this receiving core, because right now Terry McLaurin just gets doubled almost every single play, and there isn't anyone else in that receiving core who is a legitimate threat to a team. Alec Ayamanor is sure-handed. The dude is big, he's massive, he could win those 50-50 balls. Not the greatest route runner, but definitely a developmental piece who I think could come in instantly and make an impact. He's not a Quentin Johnston type of guy, like that's a bit more of a Savion Williams type of guy, but Alec Ayamanor to me is just a really good prospect that I think could be a fantastic player for years to come. Then there is the Buffalo Bills. Kenneth Grant fell in this mock draft, so I'm gonna go ahead and take him. The dude is massive. He's probably the best run stuffer in this class outside of Mason Graham. That is a Buffalo team that is pretty good at stuff in the run right now, but I think adding him would just make a lot of sense. I would go edge rusher to potentially find another guy to help alleviate the loss of probably Von Miller, but there wasn't anyone who I was like in love with, so I went ahead and took Kenneth Grant. The only player that I did seriously consider for this position was, if I can find him, Jahad Campbell, who I think can be a pass rusher, can be a blitzer, and would give this linebacking core a little bit of juice. But I think maybe you could wait and take like a Jalen Walker, he could have been the pick there too. But I think interior defensive line, taking Kenneth Grant would give them that run stuff where this team is kind of needed. Next is the Philadelphia Eagles. And I think in this situation, I talked about it a little bit earlier, I really do like the idea of taking either Jalen Walker or Jahad Campbell. Jalen Walker might be the higher upside edge rusher in this class, so I think I'm tempted to go with him in this position. I think Jalen Walker, to me, the question for him is how many years of development is he going to get? He's somebody who I think can step in right away and sort of play similar to like an Edgerrin Cooper, who is fantastic for the Green Bay Packers, but can be a little bit hit and miss, a little bit inconsistent. That's kind of what I feel with Jalen Walker. He is a really, really good athlete. He's very strong, very physical, and might be the most pure athletic player in this draft. One of, I will say, I mean, just as a pure athlete, the dude is incredible. But what I will say is, as a pass rusher, he is extremely raw. And for a team like Philadelphia, if they are going to use him as a pure pass rusher, it's going to take some time and it's going to take some up and downs. But I think Jalen Walker could develop into becoming a really, really good piece. I think early on, you might want to use him similar to like Edgerrin Cooper or like a Frankie Louvu type of guy, where he plays linebacker, but he's doing a whole bunch of blitzes, exotic looks, exotic this, and that. That's what you're going to want to do with Jalen Walker. But as a prospect, I think he's a fantastic fit for this team, especially with some question marks of whether or not Zach Bond comes back, because he's probably going to get a big time contract, and I believe he's a free agent. So putting Jalen Walker next to Nakobe Dean, I think would be fantastic. Arguably, Jalen Walker could be like a top 15 pick, but has kind of fallen down some draft boards a tad bit because once you start to watch the film, you can sort of see some flaws. And at this point in the draft, you're looking for warts. You're looking for any sort of negative thing that you can find on a player. And I think Jalen Walker might be a victim of that, but I still do think he's worthy of a first-round pick. Then there is the Chiefs, and I think Josh Connolly is clearly the pick here. You got to find offensive lineman help for this team. Joe Thuney has moved out to tackle and has looked okay, but adding a guy like Josh Connolly just makes too much sense for this team. But as you can see, that is my full mock draft. Let me know in the comment section below what you agree or what you disagree with. And if you enjoyed the video, hit the like and subscribe button. I love you guys. Peace.